December 10, 1944. An icy dawn broke over a U.S. Army prisoner of war compound in central Pennsylvania. The sky was a flat pewter, breath fogged in the air. The clatter of mess trays and the hiss of kettles punctured the cold, and the smell of hot bread and rich beef stew seemed almost obscene to men who had known hunger for months. Wehrmacht soldiers, their greatcoats crusted with frost and faces hollowed by incessant campaigning, watched in stunned silence as cooks carried plates piled with mashed potatoes, thick beef stew, slices of white bread and steaming coffee with real cream. For many, the sight registered as disbelief first and gratitude second. One private later recalled a guilty relief that felt more like an accusation than a comfort. To understand why that morning felt impossible, we move back to the autumn that made it necessary. The fighting in the Hürtgen forest opened on 19th of September 1944 and continued into December, turning narrow forest tracks into quagmires and reducing resupply to improvisation. Infantry units, engineers and support detachments fought beneath a canopy of firs while supply wagons bogged down, and field kitchens issued only what could be hauled over mud and shell-scarred trails. Hard rye bread, canned meat or sausage, small allotments of margarine, and, on a rare better day, thin soups of root vegetables. In late 1944, on that timbered front, daily sustenance was episodic and austere, a steady diet replaced by what could be carried and shared. That localized scarcity flowed from strategic pressure farther back in the system. By 1944, Allied interdiction and strategic bombing had concentrated on Germany's synthetic fuel plants, refineries and critical rail yards, drastically reducing available petroleum, oil and lubricants, and fracturing the rail network that moved supplies to the front. Without dependable pull and with junctions wrecked, motor convoys slowed or stopped, vehicle recovery lagged, and field kitchens could not be restocked on any reliable timetable. The industrial attrition inflicted on the Reich translated directly into emptier mess tables and improvisation at the company and battalion level across the Atlantic and behind. The lines an entirely different logistical arithmetic prevailed. U.S. quartermaster doctrine combined rear area kitchens, truck distribution networks, and individually packaged rations, such as the K-ration. When issued as intended, these systems were designed to provide several thousand calories per man per day, and American camps, backed by domestic food production and an organized supply chain, could deliver regular hot meals under Geneva Convention obligations. At its height, the U.S. system administered hundreds of internment compounds and was responsible for hundreds of thousands of Axis prisoners, a scale and stability that turned captive meals into a predictable part of daily life. So when steaming trays were set down in that frozen Pennsylvania yard, the response was not merely culinary. Laughter came edged with suspicion. Whispers claimed the meal must be staged for propaganda, and private gratitude between men who had subsisted on ersatz coffee and turnip soup felt almost shamefaced. For many captives, the moment crystallized a bitter. In the summer of 1941, as German columns thundered eastward under the banner of Operation Barbarossa, the Wehrmacht's logistical machinery began to falter beneath the very success of its own advance. The armies that had swept through Poland and France with clockwork precision now stretched across the endless plains of the Soviet Union, their supply lines thin, their depots hundreds of kilometers behind the front. A typical field ration, Verpflegungssatz IRA, was designed to provide roughly 2,400 calories a day, sufficient for occupation troops, but utterly inadequate for men marching 40 kilometers daily, digging positions and fighting in sweltering heat or sub-zero cold. Within weeks, bread rations were halved. Flour shipments failed to keep pace, and the bakeries of the Feldküchen were forced to mix rye hulls, potato pulp, and even powdered cellulose into loaves so dense and bitter that soldiers joked they were good for patching tank armor. Meat, once a symbol of privilege, disappeared from ordinary mess tins except for officers or special occasions. By August, the first reports from Army Group Center described men boiling unripe barley and eating raw grain stolen from Soviet barns. Supply trains derailed by partisan attacks or bottlenecked rail gauges could not reach Smolensk or Vitebsk. Entire regiments subsisted on what they could seize. A lieutenant of the 18th Panzer Division recorded in his diary that the horses eat better than the men. Iron rations, the emergency tins of hard biscuit and preserved meat, became the main course, hammered open with rifle butts and swallowed cold. "Iron," men muttered, "because only our stomachs can digest metal now." As the campaign dragged into winter, the calorie shortfall began to erode endurance itself. Frostbite and fatigue were joined by dysentery, gum infections, and a sullen hunger that dulled discipline. Letters home, censored yet revealing, spoke of American-style abundance glimpsed in captured Red Army kitchens and contrasted it bitterly with their own scarcity. The myth of German efficiency hid an uncomfortable truth. The Wehrmacht had mastered blitzkrieg tactics, but never solved the mathematics of feeding millions across a continent stripped bare. Each mile gained eastward starved the machine further. By the time Stalingrad was encircled in late 1942, a new kind of despair had settled in. Soldiers stirred frozen beet soup with bayonets, gnawed on horsehide, and wrote of dreams filled not with victory, but with bread. Malnutrition hollowed the faces of veterans who once believed themselves invincible. When these same men were later captured and given white bread and hot coffee in Allied camps, their astonishment was not merely about taste. It was the shock of men discovering that their enemy, whom they had been told was decadent and weak, could sustain an army and its prisoners with a consistency their own command never achieved. The hunger of the Eastern Front was more than a logistical failure. It was a psychological wound, preparing the ground for the disbelief and quiet gratitude that would follow in captivity. By 1943, while the Wehrmacht soldiers were scraping frost from bread crusts on the steppes of Russia, the Allied world had turned food into an instrument of war. In the United States, the humming of canneries from Chicago to Baltimore marked the rhythm of a vast logistical symphony. The Quartermaster Corps, drawing on America's immense agricultural reserves, was producing more than 500,000 tons of rations each month, an output unimaginable to German planners, who were by then cutting their field allotments in desperation. These rations, whether the compact C ration issued to combat troops or the bulk B ration for field kitchens, represented the industrial might of a nation that had learned to feed millions across oceans. A single C ration meal could contain tinned meat and beans, crackers, powdered coffee, sugar tablets, a chocolate bar, and even a few cigarettes, adding up to nearly 3,700 calories per day. What for a German infantryman had become an unattainable dream. A full, hot meal was, for an American private, the minimum standard. Across the Atlantic, Britain mirrored this efficiency with its own brand of discipline and ingenuity. Even under the shadow of the Blitz and the U-boat blockade, British planners devised composite rations for their overseas forces and for prisoners of war. Each parcel, meticulously balanced by calorie count and nutritional value, was approved by the International Red Cross and packed in standardized tins that could be stored or shipped without spoilage. The British prided themselves on maintaining a moral high ground. The Geneva Convention was not merely obeyed, it was woven into the fabric of Allied logistics. To starve a prisoner, they believed, was to surrender a part of one's own humanity. Behind the front lines, the arteries of this food empire pulsed through railways, convoys, and the cavernous holds of Liberty ships, from the stockyards of the American Midwest to the refrigerated warehouses of Liverpool. Processed food moved with military precision toward every theater of war. Liberty ships, designed for speed and mass production, ferried tons of canned meat, condensed milk, and flour to Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific. The same vessels that carried tanks and munitions also bore the invisible weight of calories, the power that sustained armies. Even amid the home front sacrifices of ration books and meatless Tuesdays, Allied citizens took pride in the knowledge that their restraint helped feed both their own troops and the captives of the enemy. For the Allies, food was more than nourishment. It was strategy, symbolism, and morale. A well-fed soldier fought harder, thought clearer, and believed more firmly in the justice of his cause. A well-fed prisoner, meanwhile, was a living testimony to Allied civilization, a silent contrast to the ideological brutality of the Reich. German prisoners who arrived in these camps often experienced something close to cognitive dissonance. The same nations their propaganda had branded decadent were now offering white bread, jam, and coffee with milk. Order, abundance, and fairness replaced the chaos and rationing of their homeland. For many, the first taste of Allied food was not just physical relief, it was a psychological reckoning, proof that the enemy's strength came not from ruthlessness, but from organization, ethics, and faith in plenty. In the quiet of their barracks, some would later admit that this too was a form of victory. In May 1943, under the blazing North African sun, the once proud Afrika Korps laid down its arms. More than 150,000 German and Italian troops, hardened by desert warfare and loyal to the legend of Rommel, marched into captivity under the flags of the Western Allies. For many of these men, the surrender was not the end of battle, but the beginning of disbelief. Their first encounters with American camps, in the dusty sprawl of Camp Swift, Texas, and the sprawling transit hub of Camp Shanks, New York, would challenge everything they had been taught about their enemy. Accustomed to surviving on dry army biscuits, watery stew, and coffee brewed from roasted barley, they stood speechless as American cooks served them roast chicken, mashed potatoes, peas, and even pie. The aroma of hot food drifting across the camp yards seemed more like a hallucination than hospitality. At first, suspicion filled the air thicker than the Texas dust. Some prisoners whispered that it was all a trick, that the Allies meant to lull them before interrogation. One corporal, captured outside Tunis, later admitted that he refused to eat his first meal, certain it had been poisoned. But as days turned into weeks, and the same abundant trays arrived with clockwork regularity, disbelief gave way to confusion. The pattern was unmistakable. Breakfast brought bread, butter, and coffee. Lunch and dinner arrived with meat, vegetables, and sometimes fruit or dessert. There were no beatings, no deliberate starvation, only discipline, paperwork, and food that seemed impossibly generous for a defeated enemy. Behind this consistency lay the bureaucratics, precision of the U.S. Army's adherence to the Geneva Convention of 1929. Its regulations required that prisoners of war receive rations equivalent to those of American soldiers, not as charity but as law. The Quartermaster Corps, which by 1943 was already feeding millions of Allied personnel worldwide, now extended that system to enemy captives with the same efficiency. Each camp kept meticulous records, calories, menus, portion sizes. Red Cross inspectors confirmed compliance, reporting favorably on conditions that stunned the prisoners themselves. Even in war-ravaged Italy, at makeshift compounds outside Naples, captured Germans were issued bread, jam, and real coffee, luxuries their comrades on the Gustav line could scarcely imagine. Rumors of these conditions spread with startling speed. Letters, heavily censored but still descriptive enough, reached families in Germany and were passed from hand to hand. "The Americans feed us better than our own army ever did," wrote one former panzer gunner to his mother in Hamburg. By late 1943, the Wehrmacht's morale officers were forced to confront a new and dangerous narrative. That captivity under the Allies might be preferable to continued service at the front. For men raised on the Nazi ideal of the merciless enemy, this realization was deeply unsettling. Allied decency, rather than brutality, became the sharper psychological weapon. The simple act of serving a full plate undermined years of propaganda that had depicted the Western powers as corrupt and inhuman. In the barracks of Texas and the temporary stockades of Italy, food became a quiet but potent ambassador. Each meal chipped away at indoctrination and replaced it with reluctant respect, or at the very least doubt. In the long war for men's minds, roast chicken and white bread did what bullets could not. They made the enemy question everything he thought he knew about who was truly civilized. By late 1943, as winter winds scoured the Eastern Front and mud clung to every boot, Berlin began receiving reports that threatened more than just pride. It threatened the very morale of the Wehrmacht. Intelligence gathered by Abteilung Fremde Heere West, the Wehrmacht's office responsible for analyzing the armies of the West, painted a picture that seemed almost absurd. German prisoners, captured in North Africa and Italy, were being fed better than their comrades at the front. Testimonies from repatriated soldiers, corroborated by Red Cross inspections, described fresh bread, butter, vegetables, milk, and meat regularly, and in quantities sufficient to sustain health and vigor. Some officers, conditioned to distrust any report that might undermine the image of the enemy, dismissed these claims as propaganda designed to weaken German resolve. Yet others understood the psychological stakes. Inside the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the High Command convened over stacks of censored letters and internal memoranda. One directive explicitly forbade the return of any correspondence from POWs that mentioned Allied rations, fearing that a single enthusiastic letter could ripple across battalions and plant seeds of doubt. Even so, the truth found cracks through which it seeped. Soldiers writing home to parents and wives occasionally slipped references to hot meals, coffee with cream, or a rare sweet treat, and these accounts spread quietly from town to town. On the front lines in Russia and Italy, men began trading bitter jokes. They would be better fed in an American cage than under Hitler's command. The irony was cutting. An empire that had prided itself on efficiency and superiority could not even guarantee bread for its own sons. This growing awareness did more than amuse. It destabilized belief. Officers worried that the contrast between starvation at the front and abundance in captivity could erode obedience, discipline, and ultimately loyalty to the regime. Soldiers whispered to each other, questioning the certainties they had long carried. If the enemy was capable of feeding prisoners well, who was truly civilized? The reports hinted at a deeper fracture, one that no propaganda could fully conceal. Behind the official lines of censorship and rhetoric, a quiet reckoning was underway, and the seeds of surrender, mass capitulations that would sweep through Normandy, the Rhineland, and eventually across all of Germany, were being sown. What the Allies provided in food and humane treatment, the Wehrmacht could not match, and the psychological consequences would soon manifest on a scale even the High Command could not contain. By 1944, the International Committee of the Red Cross had assumed a central role in defining what captivity could and should look like. Across more than 100 Allied-run camps in the United States, Canada, and Britain, inspectors moved through rows of barracks, kitchens, and mess halls with a meticulous eye. Their reports noted that prisoners received rations averaging 3,000 calories daily, far exceeding the meager allowances soldiers had endured on the Eastern Front or in North Africa. Bread arrived in weekly shipments, fresh fruit and vegetables supplemented the standard fare, and meat, whether beef, chicken, or pork, was a regular feature rather than a rare indulgence. Beyond these institutional meals, the Red Cross facilitated parcels from home and neutral intermediaries. Condensed milk, chocolate, cigarettes, and other small comforts filtered into the hands of even the most senior officers, including captured SS personnel. Inspectors frequently lauded the United States for exemplary compliance with the Geneva Convention, a phrase that resonated profoundly when contrasted with reports from German-run camps, where Allied and Soviet prisoners often endured starvation. Exposure and brutality. For the men of the Wehrmacht, accustomed to rigid hierarchy and often harsh treatment in both training and the field, this visible impartiality was remarkable. German captives watched Red Cross delegates walk freely through kitchens, sample meals, and note their observations in official logs. There was no threat of reprisal for speaking openly. Inspections were routine, methodical, and fully authorized. Many prisoners later confessed that this transparency forced them to reassess long-held assumptions about their enemies. Here was an army capable of overwhelming force, yet it operated within a framework of law and human decency, feeding even its prisoners according to codified international standards. It was not generosity in a casual sense, but a systemic insistence on fairness that carried both moral and practical weight. The consequences of such oversight rippled far beyond the camp gates. Allied adherence to the Geneva Convention became a living argument against Nazi propaganda, a demonstration that military power need not entail cruelty. For German POWs, the experience was both humbling and disorienting. The discipline and predictability of the system highlighted deficiencies in their own military, while the humane treatment undermined the narrative that the Western Allies were decadent or morally weak. Food, abundance, and procedural rigor combined to create a subtle but powerful form of psychological influence. The foundation of POW decency rested not only on calories or sustenance, but on the predictable application of law and principle, a framework many German soldiers encountered for the first time. In this environment, every meal became more than nourishment. It became a lesson in morality, logistics, and the strategic potency of humane conduct, setting the stage for the even larger waves of surrender that would sweep across Europe in 1944 and 1945. Inside the POW camps, food quickly assumed a central role, shaping the rhythm and psychology of daily life. Dawn brought long lines of prisoners waiting for breakfast, steaming bowls of oatmeal, mugs of hot coffee, and on fortunate days, eggs or fresh bread. Lunch offered hearty stews, pasta dishes or casseroles, while dinner frequently included meatloaf, roast chicken or vegetables prepared with care. German prisoners assigned to kitchen duty worked alongside U.S. Army cooks, learning American techniques while often adapting meals to German taste. Using Red Cross-supplied flour, they baked rice-style loaves and pretzels, attempting to recreate familiar textures and flavors. At Camp Aliceville in Alabama, inventive inmates even brewed ersatz beer from potato peels and apples, an act of ingenuity that offered both comfort and a connection to home. On holidays, the kitchens served turkey with all the trimmings and pie for dessert, moments that elicited astonishment and reluctant gratitude from men who had endured months or years of near starvation. These meals did more than nourish the body. They fostered an unusual form of cultural exchange. American guards and officers observed that prisoners who had eaten well were calmer, more cooperative, and more willing to engage in organized activities. Music, education, and hobbies flourished in the post-meal hours as prisoners read, wrote letters, or performed for each other, a quiet testament to the stabilizing power of sustenance. One U.S. Army report dryly noted, "Our best security measure is a full stomach," underscoring how logistical care translated directly into discipline and safety. For men hardened on the frozen plains of Russia or the deserts of North Africa, these abundant meals were both a relief and a revelation. Their captors could exert authority without cruelty, enforce rules without humiliation, and yet respect the dignity of the men in their charge. Food became the heartbeat of camp life, structuring the day and offering a small but potent sense of normalcy. It highlighted the contrast between the Wehrmacht's desperation at the front and the methodical generosity of Allied administration. In each steaming tray and each carefully measured portion, German prisoners saw more than nourishment. They saw the tangible difference between a regime crippled by logistics and ideology and a system rooted in law, order, and the value of human life. Over time, this rhythm of kitchens, queues, and shared meals became emblematic, a quiet, persistent demonstration that civilization, even in wartime, could coexist with strength. The daily act of feeding men who had once been enemies quietly set the stage for the psychological unraveling of Nazi myths and the broader moral authority of the Allies. By the winter of 1943, the gulf between captivity in the West and the East could not have been more stark. After the surrender at Stalingrad in February, approximately 91,000 German soldiers were taken by the Red Army, yet only around 5,000 would ever see home again. The conditions in Soviet camps were nightmarish. Men were given meager rations, often no more than 800 calories per day, insufficient to sustain life. Starvation became routine, compounded by exposure, disease, and forced labor. Survivors recounted gnawing on tree bark, boiling leather from harnesses, and hunting rats to stave off death. Letters and diaries that did survive painted a grim tableau, one that contrasted violently with the tales of abundance emerging from US and British camps. For German families and soldiers still fighting, these accounts created a visceral awareness. Captivity in the West could offer bread and meat, even chocolate, while captivity in the East meant hunger, suffering, and often annihilation. This disparity quickly became a psychological instrument. Allied intelligence, keenly aware of its propaganda potential, circulated photographs of well-fed German POWs in American and British camps, ensuring that news of humane treatment reached soldiers still entrenched in battle. The images were stark. Men standing in orderly lines, trays of steaming food in hand, smiles breaking through the weariness of defeat. Reports suggested that these messages encouraged surrender among German units facing overwhelming odds in Italy, France, and the Low Countries. Entire formations began to weigh the relative safety of American captivity against the specter of Soviet camps, and in many cases, the choice was clear. By late 1944, it was not uncommon for German soldiers to maneuver their retreats with the explicit goal of encountering US forces rather than the advancing Red Army. Food, in this context, became more than mere sustenance. It became a tool of persuasion and a symbol of moral authority. The contrast between ideologically brutalized imprisonment in the East and the disciplined, humane treatment in the West revealed a larger truth. War need not obliterate humanity, and surrender could be not only survival, but dignity preserved. For many Wehrmacht soldiers, the promise of bread, meat, and regular rations outweighed pride or fear, reshaping decisions on the battlefield in ways that logistical historians have noted as significant in the final campaigns of 1944-45. As units capitulated en masse, the lessons of Stalingrad and the disparities in captivity underscored a simple but powerful equation. Where hunger and cruelty reigned, men died. Where order, law, and sustenance prevailed, surrender became a path to life. This duality of treatment, cruelty versus humane discipline, set the stage for the mass capitulations that would soon sweep across Germany, revealing just how profoundly the provision of food could influence both morale and the course of war. By the spring of 1945, the scope of the Allied POW system had reached unprecedented proportions. The United States alone held over 370,000 German prisoners, while Britain managed another 402,000, spread across hundreds of camps and temporary holding facilities. Feeding such immense numbers was a feat of logistics that rivaled the supply of entire states. At Camp Hearn, Texas, for instance, records indicate that 3,000 loaves of bread were consumed each day, alongside thousands of pounds of meat, vegetables, and powdered milk. Even in the midst of global shortages, the U.S. Army maintained full rations for prisoners, occasionally substituting pork or cornmeal when shipments fell behind, but never compromising on the overall caloric or nutritional value of the daily menus. Across the Atlantic, Britain relied on the wider Commonwealth network to sustain its camps. Flour arrived from Canadian mills, mutton from Australian pastures, and preserves from Britain itself, all carefully portioned to meet the War Department's stringent guidelines. Each meal was meticulously calculated for calories, protein, and vitamins, and monitored by the International Committee of the Red Cross to ensure compliance with the Geneva Convention. The sheer precision and scale of this operation reflected the height of Allied industrial power, a capability unmatched by the Axis, which routinely rationed its own soldiers below subsistence while attempting to maintain frontline effectiveness. For the German prisoners, the experience was almost surreal. Men who had survived frostbitten marches, meager field rations, and months of hunger now found themselves receiving consistent, balanced meals. They realized, often for the first time, that their captors' strength was rooted not in exploitation or cruelty, but in meticulous organization and abundant resources. Food became more than sustenance. It was a subtle instrument of psychological influence, a daily reminder that discipline, law, and industrial efficiency could coexist with humanity. One former prisoner reflected decades later, "We learned through food what freedom meant," capturing the revelation that nourishment could convey both care and power. The success of this massive feeding effort was not merely tactical. It laid the foundation for broader post-war initiatives. By demonstrating the capacity to feed and care for millions of men, enemy soldiers included, the Allies built a framework of trust and stability that would inform the occupation, reconstruction, and eventual integration of Germany into a post-war Europe. The logistics of feeding millions became a quiet triumph of organization, morality, and foresight, proving that the machinery of war could also sustain the principles of civilization. In this way, the simple act of providing meals transformed captivity into a stage for both humanitarian achievement and the subtle exertion of soft power, setting the tone for the final months of conflict and the rebuilding that followed. By the winter of 1944-45, psychologists and military observers began to recognize a subtle but profound effect of food on the minds of prisoners. In Allied camps across the United States, Canada, and Britain, German POWs who received regular, nutritious, and well-prepared meals exhibited markedly higher morale, fewer disciplinary problems, and a reduced desire to escape. Beyond mere contentment, consistent rations fostered reflection. Men who had endured frostbitten marches and meager field provisions now saw their own beliefs challenged. Observing American soldiers eat the same meals that were offered to them undermined decades of Nazi propaganda, depicting the West as decadent, weak, or morally corrupt. Shared meals became an unspoken vehicle for education and subtle reorientation. In some camps, coffee and cigarettes were offered as incentives to attend lectures on democracy, civic responsibility, or even basic economics. Newsletters circulated within barracks prompted debates over agriculture, rationing, and industrial organization, often highlighting how Allied abundance mirrored a broader social stability, absent in wartime Germany. Butter on bread, fresh fruit, and hot stew became, in essence, tokens of freedom, proof that order and generosity could coexist with power. Diaries and letters from POWs frequently record astonishment and emerging admiration. The fairness of their captors was tangible, and it contrasted sharply with the cruelty or neglect they had known under Nazi command. Food became more than nourishment. It was a quiet instrument of persuasion, stronger than any leaflet or loudspeaker campaign. The act of feeding, measured and consistent, facilitated clarity of thought and reflection. Soldiers who were well fed could assess the war, their place within it, and the morality of their leaders with a lucidity that starvation had previously denied them. In this clarity, old loyalties began to erode. Ideological convictions that had once seemed absolute were questioned. The moral authority of the Reich weakened not on the battlefield, but across tables laden with bread, meat, and coffee. This transformation was a hidden triumph of the POW system. While guns, tanks, and bombs dominated headlines, the Allied camps achieved a different kind of conquest, a moral victory, realized not through violence but through decency, organization, and nourishment. By providing reliable sustenance and respecting the dignity of the men in their custody, the Allies demonstrated that power and humanity need not be mutually exclusive. Food, in this context, became both a shield and a sword, a subtle but decisive tool that reshaped minds, influenced decisions, and quietly prepared the ground for surrender, reconciliation, and the post-war rebuilding of Germany. Not every Allied camp lived up to the ideal of abundance. In the closing months of 1945, the sheer scale of demobilization and the influx of newly captured soldiers placed immense strain on even the most well-organized systems. At Camp Remagen, on the western banks of the Rhine, temporary enclosures known as the Rheinwiesenlager, or Rhine meadow camps, were hastily constructed to hold hundreds of thousands of German prisoners under open skies. Here the routines of kitchens, mess halls, and Red Cross inspections were impossible to maintain. Food was limited, sanitation inadequate, and exposure to harsh weather claimed many lives before more permanent facilities could be established. These camps were intended as transitional holding areas, yet for the men confined within them, the experience left lasting physical and psychological scars. Allied officials later admitted to planning shortcomings, but emphasized that these failures were logistical rather than deliberate policy. Elsewhere, minor tensions erupted when prisoners rejected unfamiliar rations, refusing cornmeal, canned peaches, or other staples unfamiliar to their palates. Red Cross inspectors intervened, recommending adjustments, increasing deliveries, and improving distribution. By late 1946, these corrections stabilized conditions, demonstrating the system's capacity for adaptation and oversight. Even as Remagen and other temporary sites highlighted the vulnerability of supply chains, they also underscored the extraordinary scale and effectiveness of the broader POW operation. Feeding millions of enemy soldiers across continents amid war and post-war upheaval was an achievement far beyond what the Axis powers had managed for their own troops or for prisoners they held. The temporary chaos of the Rhine meadow camps served as a stark reminder that decency, like logistics, required constant vigilance. Regular rations, humane treatment, and adherence to international law were not automatic. They depended on organization, oversight, and the maintenance of both moral and material authority. From these early failures, the Allies learned crucial lessons in camp management, supply planning, and humanitarian oversight. These lessons would influence not only the final months of the war, but the occupation and reconstruction of Germany, helping ensure that hunger, once wielded as a weapon by regimes, would never again be used as a tool of policy. Even in imperfection, the operation highlighted the contrast between Allied resolve and Axis neglect. While temporary shortages brought suffering, the overall system remained a testament to industrial might, legal principle, and the moral strategy of feeding rather than punishing enemies. As 1946 began, the shadow of war still hung over Europe. But many former German POWs remained in Allied nations, employed under formal labor agreements to aid in reconstruction. They harvested fields, repaired railways, and rebuilt bombed towns, their work often sustained by the same rations that had once been issued within camp walls. For countless men, the experience reshaped their worldview. Resentment softened and understanding took root. Historians have noted that thousands of repatriated soldiers cited these experiences when later embracing democratic institutions in post-war Germany, describing fair treatment in captivity as a catalyst for civic awakening. The philosophy extended beyond former POWs. American food aid under the Marshall Plan soon reached civilians across a devastated continent, reflecting the same principle witnessed in the camps: nourishment as a tool for stability and reconciliation. The contrast with Hitler's regime was stark. Where the Third Reich had wielded hunger as a weapon, through the starvation of Leningrad, the systematic deprivation of occupied territories, and the chronic underfeeding of its own soldiers, the Allies demonstrated that generosity and organization could wield equal, if not greater, power. Feeding an enemy became an act of victory, a demonstration that authority and compassion could coexist, that order and humanity were not mutually exclusive. Food, in this context, became a currency of both morality and politics. It did not buy blind submission, but trust, cooperation, and respect. The memories of hot meals, fresh bread, and carefully prepared dishes lingered in the minds of former captives, shaping attitudes long after the war had ended. In this way, the POW experience prefigured the broader reconstruction of Europe. Cities rebuilt not only with machinery and finance, but through the enduring lessons of care, organization, and shared sustenance. As ships carried grain, milk, and flour to devastated German ports in 1947, the image of full plates in captivity remained a quiet but powerful testament, proof that mercy and logistical skill could succeed where intimidation and starvation had failed. The story of food in Allied POW camps thus became inseparable from the story of post-war recovery, illustrating how nourishment could transform not only bodies, but hearts and societies, paving the way for a new, more humane Europe. In the hushed aftermath of war, former German prisoners often recalled their first Allied meal as a profound revelation. It was in that simple act, steaming stew ladled into a tin, fresh bread passed along a line, coffee thick with cream, that they recognized the war's true outcome. Not on the shattered battlefields of the Eastern Front or the sands of North Africa, but in the kitchens of Texas, Alabama, and Normandy, defeat had been quietly made manifest. The slogans of the Reich, the promises of superiority and inevitability, collided with the reality of an enemy who could wield power without cruelty, discipline without deprivation, and organization without oppression. Men who had endured frostbitten marches and meager rations now understood that strength and humanity could coexist, a paradox that undermined ideology as surely as any tank or artillery barrage. Food became an unexpected instructor in the principles of democracy, a universal language bridging nationalities and past enmities. The simple act of feeding, repeated daily, conveyed respect, fairness, and moral authority in a way that propaganda or speeches could not. As peace returned to a fractured continent, many former POWs carried home a reluctant gratitude for those who had once held them captive. The memory of well-prepared meals behind barbed wire endured, serving as a quiet testament to a different kind of strength, the power to sustain life rather than deny it. Within this paradox lay the true victory of the Allied world. It was a triumph not only of logistics and industrial capacity, but of conscience and strategy intertwined. Feeding an enemy became a demonstration of superiority that transcended bullets and bombs, a lesson in restraint, morality, and the humane application of power. The story of German POWs, stunned by the generosity of those they had been taught to hate, remains one of World War II's most profoundly human narratives. In The Taste of Bread, the warmth of stew and the steadiness of daily rations, men who had once known only hunger and fear experienced, for the first time, a form of freedom. In that experience, the Allies achieved a quiet, enduring conquest, proof that the simplest acts of care could leave a legacy as lasting as any battlefield victory.